This conference will now be recorded.
Right. So just to give a quick recap on the workflow that we're following, again, this is something that I'm doing on a regular basis. Reason being, DevOps workflow, something that we need to understand before we move forward with that. So I have a repository and I'm storing all my code plus my infrastructure also in the repository. So now I have a code plus the infra. It's not just the code. I have a folder for code. I also have a folder for infrastructure. And what I'm doing is that I have a branch inside this particular repository which is protected. It's a Git based branch, and I'm calling this as a develop branch. And I have some policies on this particular branch telling that I at least need one person to review and approve the code. I need the work items to be linked. I also need the comments to be resolved. A couple of things out here as such. So I'm putting all these policies, all these things out here as such. And after that, I am going ahead and I went ahead and created something called as a build pipeline or a continuous integration pipeline, which kicks off every time the develop branch is updated, and the develop branch can only be updated using a pull request. This pipeline will go ahead and now give me the artifacts, and the artifacts, I'm talking about two different artifacts out here. One being the .zip file, the .zip file, the other being the .json file. Plus, in my build pipeline yesterday, I also went ahead and added a copy task, which takes my artifacts or which takes that particular file, copies it, copies that particular file over to the artifact staging directory, so that the release pipeline can start using this out, or the release pipeline can start consuming this out. So I'm putting a release pipeline as well out here, telling that for a release pipeline, this will consume that particular artifact and then start deploying this artifact onto an Azure web app that is running in the Azure portal and on the Azure cloud. And this release pipeline is able to communicate with that particular Azure web app by using something called as a service connection. And also very importantly, we have implemented infrastructure as a code, which means that first the application will get built, meaning the application will get created, the infrastructure will get created, and then the code will be released on top of that particular infrastructure out here. This is what we are trying to do in the end-to-end workflow, and that's what we tried to achieve yesterday. And we are doing a single stage deployment, meaning we are just telling that there is a stage called development, and we are testing all these things out in development, so that in the coming classes, or in, let's say, in this particular class, we will expand our knowledge and understand how do I deploy the same code into something like QA, or into something like staging, into something like production, and so on and so forth out here as such. So that's what I am right now looking into. That's what we are right now, kind of looking into out here. So yes, any questions still here? Anyone, any questions still here in this entire workflow? Any questions that I can take, or anything that is not really, let's say, understandable? Again, just to give you an idea, this is my repository, which has code in the infrastructure, and the branch is also protected using the policies. So I have multiple policies which are protecting my branch. I also have a build pipeline which is configured for continuous integration, that has a continuous integration trigger, which has tasks like restore, build, test, and publish. After that, I added one more task called copy files to something called build.artifact staging directory, which is nothing but the location under which all your artifacts are really stored. And I'm here copying all the JSON files. And finally, I'm doing a publish artifact. And my artifacts look something like this. It's one published. If I expand this out, I have a random codes.zip and I have a web app.json. And then my release pipeline out here, which looks something like this. It has something called the ARM template deployment. It's using multiple things like the resource group name, the template itself in the first place, and also I went ahead and passed things like dev plan 01, and also the name of the web application that I'm creating. And I went ahead and I deployed this out here as such. And this is how my pipeline looks like. So yes, any questions still here? Anyone, any questions still here that I can take? Let's see this chat window. Let's see. Can we get agent also with IAC? When you say agent with IAC, can you please elaborate on this, please? I do not really understand this out. Meaning, are you telling that can we deploy the agent using IAC, or how? What exactly do you mean by this? Okay, I'll circle back on that. But yes, deploy agent. Yes, you can deploy agent also. You can create a virtual machine using an ARM template and then configure that particular virtual machine. Okay, yes, you can do that. You can do that with infrastructure as a code. Definitely, yes.
In which scenarios we use the release pipeline? In which all scenarios we use it?
In whichever scenario you would like to deploy the code or run some test cases, all these things, right? You can also do it with a build pipeline. You can take that build pipeline, you can deploy your infrastructure, deploy the code using the build pipeline, etc. But what a release pipeline now gives you is that now it gives you an opportunity to go ahead and give some approvals out here. For example, there is something called pre-deployment conditions, which we'll talk about, wherein you can put in approvers telling that, okay, fine, before I deploy this code, I need someone from the development team to approve this particular code before I go into it. So for checks and approvals, not only this, if you do not have a pre-deployment condition, you can also set up some deployment gates. You can say, I want a 5-minute delay, or I want to invoke a REST API call to an Azure function, or I want to check whether the Sonar report is good, or I want to check some monitoring alerts and all these things out here as such. So a deployment or a release pipeline is primarily used to go ahead and release your code onto the Azure environments in a controlled way by giving some approvers, some checks and all these things out here. So most of the scenarios that requires the release in a phased manner, we would be using something like a release pipeline out here. And to build your code, meaning to generate your artifacts, we would use the build pipeline out here as such. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically in the continuous deployment process, right?
Correct.
Continuous delivery will take care of automatically deploying without
Again,
any approval.
again, the there's a fine line between continuous deployment and delivery, and usually companies right now they're following a continuous delivery process. And even during a continuous delivery, when I say delivery, it's just that taking small bits of pieces of your code in sprint cycles and then deploying it onto your platform or onto your infrastructure. Even in a continuous delivery process, you would still need approvals, because I am changing a production system. I'm changing something on the production system. I would still need some checks. I would still need some approvals on the continuous delivery process as well.
So in that case, the deployment and delivery, what is the difference? I mean, the approvals are auto approvals in delivery
Not really.
process.
Deployment and delivery, the main difference is how you are pushing it out. Meaning, are you pushing the entire code at once? You're doing a deployment. Or are you doing a continuous delivery cycle? Very importantly, you're acting in form of a sprint. So that's what even that particular principle talks about. The approvals and checks, these are all same for deployment or delivery. These are all same. So if you look at this, that's what it's telling you. Continuous deployment goes one step further than continuous delivery with the practice and all that stuff. So if you look at this one, it's telling what exactly is delivery and deployment. And delivery is in a very phased manner. It's in a phased manner with all the approvals. Deployment is at one go, telling you, okay, fine, you know what, I'll go ahead and and do it all these things and etc. So on and so forth. But yes, delivery and deployment, both of them, I mean, they have a very fine line. Both of them aim for a non-human intervention, wherein they're telling, okay, fine, you know what, let me put some auto test cases and all these things out. But in practice, in reality, you will still need human intervention out here, so that your clients or so that your QAs can go ahead and, let's say, approve your code before you go ahead and push it out here as such.
Okay.
Yes, because see, there's a lot of difference between the theory and practice. So in theory, you define a lot of things, but when you do the actual practice, when you do go ahead and, let's say, practice all these principles out, it completely depends upon how your organization really needs it. I mean, does your organization need completely a non-human intervention cycle, wherein you automate your test cases, or do you still need? For example, I worked in projects where client has to come down, approve it out, only then the code can be pushed, because the client itself knows what is the traffic, or the client himself knows what is the kind of traffic he's experiencing there. Sometimes they would say, okay, fine, you know what, I don't need this code because there's a lot of traffic, I don't want to disturb my users, so on and so forth. So I've seen 99% of the cases, they would need approvers before you go ahead and, let's say, push the code out here as such.
Yeah, yeah. The production deployments always requires a governance. Understand?
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, there's a governance, there's an accountability. You also need to account for the downtime factors and all these things out here as such. Yes. Any more questions out here, guys? All right. So let's explore a little further. And this is what I'm now telling is that the deployment or the delivery cycle that we're really looking at, or the release pipeline, the release cycle that we're really looking at in a real-time environment, is not a straightforward approach. What do I mean by that is this: I have multiple teams here, it's a slight disconnect. Right? There's something called as an operations team. So there are multiple teams who are working hand in hand in order to make sure to improvise your code. To the entire aim of all these teams together, they're working hand to hand out here, is to make sure that the code delivery goes smooth, and also I am producing a bug-free code, or the code which is really efficient out here, which doesn't need, let's say, frequent fixes, frequent patches, and all these things out here. So what these teams suggest is that usually they say, okay, fine, you know what? First, I'll give the importance to a developer, and I now say that, okay, fine, the release will first go into an environment or a stage, because release now happens in the form of stages. So I would say a stage called development. I would say let my first release go into a stage called development, wherein I will give the developer a control over the web app. And I'm telling, okay, fine, you have a contributor access on this particular web app. Go ahead, and I will, using a deployment pipeline or a delivery pipeline at my end, I will deploy this particular code on top of your development environment. Now, you as a developer, or you as a team of developers, because I'm not talking about a simple web app. In reality, there might be a lot of web apps that are working together with each other. Microservice architecture, wherein multiple web apps, multiple developers might contribute to multiple pieces of the code, and they have the URL, and they can go ahead and start their testing. They can say, okay, fine, this piece of code I've added, is this really working? Is this functionality really working? Or this is the functionality which is expected in this release. Is it bug free? And all these things out. And once the development team goes ahead and says, okay, fine, you know what, we are all good and all that stuff, we get into a call. I mean, developers get into a call with the technical lead, and they say, okay, fine, these are the functionalities, this is all good. And then the technical lead of that particular delivery team or that particular development team would tell, okay, fine, you know what, I am good with this. Let's promote the code to the next stage. Let's go ahead, take this code to the next stage, which usually would be a QA, or a testing state, or a testing stage out here, wherein again I'm expected to create a web app or an infrastructure for the QAs, which, or my pipeline will now then go ahead and, let's say, deploy the code onto that particular web app. So if it's a dev web app, then I'll create a QA web app with a different plan out here as such. Probably the QA might want a different plan, like, let's say he wants an S1 plan with auto scaling to understand how the web application is working under peak load, how the web application is going ahead and responding to different scenarios, and so on and so forth. And the set of QA teams, they go ahead and they perform their own test cases, They've already given me the test case. I've implemented in the pipeline, but they still have a couple of test cases that they want to, let's say, perform out here using something like Selenium or APM or something like that. They perform their own test cases. They say, okay, fine, how the functionality is working under different scenarios. And if they are good, they are good. Again, they have their own QA leads. They go ahead and inform their QA leads saying that, yes, these are the scenarios we tested. This is the report of everything that we tested out here. We are good with this. Can we take it to the next stage? And that's where my operations team can come into picture, wherein I can give them an environment called UAT, user acceptance test, or we can also call this as a staging environment. Wherein now the operations team, they have their own test cases. They want to, let's say, take a piece of it, and they would want to test this code in a very phased manner. They would want to, let's say, run down their own test cases out here and etc. And finally, the code moves into production with the approvals from my client into production. Again, I'm just giving you a very ideal scenario, a very ideal example, one of an example. In an organization, probably you might have slots and they might have tested, I mean, they're testing it in slots. Or you might have multiple web applications for a particular environment. It depends upon the budget and depends upon the quality that you want to really ensure. But finally, you will have a phase called production, which is like code going go live, my application of the code going go live out here, wherein I am now telling that, okay, fine, with the approvals from my client, I'll deploy this entire piece of code onto something known as a production environment. And once the code is deployed in a production environment, I, as an end user who's using this particular application, is now going to see the changes on the platform. So I'm now going to see the changes on the UI, wherein it would say something like, okay, fine, the code is changed or the functionality has been added, whatever that you're trying to really achieve out here as such. So in an actual case scenario, when you're really looking at, let's say, a real-time environment out here, it's very important that the pipeline moves in a very phased or in a phased order, wherein the testing and the development go in hand, and also we do it in a regular cycle. In our sprint cycles, in the end of the sprint, we are expected to do some delivery onto the production so that the end user can go ahead and, let's say, see the change, or if there is an issue, they go ahead and fix this out again. In case, let's say, the cycle starts all the way from here, I, as a developer, I am going ahead changing a piece of a code, uh, doing a pull request into the develop branch. Once the pull request is approved, once the required checks are done, it goes into the build pipeline, builds it out. If something fails here in the build stage, depending upon what is a failure, whether it's a restoration failure, whether it's a build failure, or whether it's a DevOps failure, we go ahead address this out and retrigger this out. Or if it's a code failure, we need to address something, then the developer needs to come back again, pull his own feature branch, address that particular code, again do a pull request, again trigger the build pipeline. And once the build pipeline is good, reduce the artifact out of it, go into the release pipeline, deploy it onto the development environment, hold it here. Again, the same developer tests this code out, running on the actual cloud environment, does some scenarios. If it fails, if he identifies bugs here, I'm not taking the code further to the QA or to the staging or to the production, because I need a code which is bug free. Then I, as a developer, will again come back. Now I'll say, okay, fine, again, let me address those issues. Let me do, let's say, the pull request, and then go through the entire cycle, go into the development phase, test this out, get my approvals right, then go to the QA. And if it fails here, again, produce the entire cycle, reproduce the entire cycle out here. If it's good here, move into the third stage of filtration, which is staging. If my operations team is good, they go ahead, have a word with the client, telling that, okay, fine, you know what, we are good with this. These are all the test cases. These are all the things that we're releasing out here. Are you good? Give us a date when you want to release it out. And this is the code. This is the pipeline. Go ahead, approve it out. Once the client is okay, go ahead, approve this out and take the code into production. So if you look at this, it's not a straightforward process, guys. This is a process that involves a lot of, let's say, iterations, a lot of corrections, and you might not get your delivery cycles right for the first two sprints, because of course your product is just being developed. So the client might understand that it's just being developed right now. It will take some time to go ahead and, let's say, give you that particular delivery cycle out here as such. But in a nutshell, this is how the entire workflow really goes through. So from the PR to the build, to the build to the release, and to the release, it goes into some environments, gets tested, gets promoted, and finally reaches your production out here as such. And the production here is your finished product, wherein the actual user can go ahead and interact with the application and go ahead and let's say appreciate the changes that we have done over a period of time. And all these cycles should happen or will happen in a very phased manner, in a time bound manner out here as such. Okay, questions here is that does the development QA will have different infrastructure, be having the same software, different software or the same? It can be different infrastructure, or it can be the same infrastructure using slots if you want to, let's say, cut down on the budget or cut down or limit the amount of, let's say, money that you're spending on your infrastructure. But it's the same software that's being tested. So build once, test multiple times. That's the principle out here that we really need to really follow out here as such.
Kiran, one question.
Good, please.
This entire life cycle is for application deployment, right? So for
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure as a code to
Okay.
build infrastructure on the
Okay.
cloud. So
Mhm.
do we need to follow the pull request, or webhooks will take care of it? So let's say
No,
developer,
yes, good, please. Mhm.
yeah, developer or infrastructure guy, automation guy
Mhm.
has
Mhm.
created a template
Okay.
like Azure ARM templates
Mhm.
and push the code to repository. So then
Okay.
automatically it should kick in the build process, right?
Right.
So
It will kick in the build process. That's true. But just to hold you there, uh, I'm an infrastructure guy. Let's say I'm a DevOps engineer. I'm trying to make some changes onto my infrastructure. Now, when I'm making the changes to the infrastructure, I still would use a pull request. Reason being, I might not be the only DevOps engineer who's working on the same infrastructure. Maybe
yeah,
there's someone
yeah,
else who's working, right? So it, I would say it should come via the pull request. Yes.
yeah. After the pull request, so
Hmm.
is there any webhook concept to invoke the build pipeline?
Again,
Or
webhooks are for external parties. Let's say whenever you want to approve a pull request, you want to send that particular notification across to a Slack or to a Teams channel. That's where webhook comes into picture. Webhook is for external notifications or external triggers out here. But internally, all you need is just this. You go into the build pipeline, just the trigger, enable continuous integration, give the branch that you need. That's it. Internally, this should take care of it. So
okay,
webhook doesn't come into picture here. Triggers come into picture here.
all right, okay. In Jenkins, I mean, it is slightly different here.
Mm-hmm.
So when the code is committed to the
Mm-hmm.
repository,
Okay.
either you can configure a webhook which can trigger the
Okay.
build process, or
Okay.
the build like Jenkins can poll the changes for the changes onto the
Polling server.
repository.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
You can do that. Yes. So yes, in Jenkins, yes, you have to configure the webhook, or you can do, you can give a cron expression and ask Jenkins to poll that particular source repository
right.
for every 5 minutes or 10 minutes and see if there are any changes. And if there are any changes, then it'll go ahead and let's say, trigger a build off. In Azure
See.
DevOps,
Hmm.
yes, it's simplified. When I say it's simplified, all it needs is that a commit happening on a repository, and using that particular commit ID, internally it goes ahead and let's say calls that particular API that's responsible to trigger your build pipeline, processes it out, gives you and so on and so forth out here as such.
Can we schedule the builds in Azure here, the build process? Can
Definitely.
we schedule it like cron jobs, right?
Yes,
Okay,
definitely
schedule.
you can. You can, yeah. You can go ahead and schedule this
All
out.
right.
You can schedule it out for, again, when you want to give a cron, it's possible here in a classic. But if you do a YAML, if you do a YAML pipeline, then of course, yes, you can give a cron job for the build, which goes ahead and let's say polls your source control manager for every 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever interval that you want. And if there are any changes, it goes and triggers it off. Yes, you can do that. So, Azure DevOps again is just a watered down version of Jenkins. The UI is
Yeah.
better, the integrations are better. So it's just a watered down version again. How can we
But in
get the parallel
Jenkins, right?
servers?
I mean, we
Mhm.
have a
Go
lot
ahead,
of
please.
It's
Mhm.
a collection of plugins, right? I mean,
Correct.
you can plug in a lot of other software. Like, for
Mhm.
example, if you want to plug in Datadog, right?
Mhm.
So you
Mhm.
can do that.
Correct.
Similarly, in Azure pipelines, can we
Mhm.
also plug in various
Of
third-party
course.
services?
Of course, yes. You have Ant, Maven, Gradle. So, for example, if you want to install multiple things, you can go into the marketplace and you can request for a plugin out here. For example, let's say Datadog. Let's see if I have Datadog out here. I mean, it should be there. Datadog extension for Azure Marketplace should be there. Something similar. Yes, Datadog monitors for deployment gates. Get it free. You can install this out. So
Okay.
the plugins that you call in Jenkins, we call it as a marketplace extensions out here. So it's nothing but an extension. You can get that extension, install that out, and if you see this, as I said, you have the Datadog monitor, query Datadog monitors to do all these things out here as such. Yes, you can do that.
Okay.
And one question in the chat is that how can we get the parallel jobs in the agent hosted process? We know this is something that we addressed already on how do you get the parallel jobs. Firstly, you will have to give the parallelism request for that. You have to raise a parallelism request firstly. How do you get the parallel jobs? If you are in a self-hosted, you can go and create multiple agents out here, put it into your pool, you get the parallel jobs out here. Or if you are doing a hosted, not a Microsoft hosted, you'll have to purchase that particular, let's say, parallel jobs out here as such. And again, the cost of purchase would be around 3,000 rupees per a parallel job out here as such.
What is that? It runs multiple builds, is it?
It
Parallel.
kicks off multiple, yes, multiple builds parallelly, yes.
And the
Yes, any more
notification
questions?
also we are going to see it, right? Like trigger notifications at the end of whether the build fails or succeeds. So notification has
That's
to send it.
again, that's automatically configured. That's what I was saying. Is that earlier classes is what I was talking about on the notification front.
Okay.
Look at this. All these are my notifications, right? It's going to tell you that what is the build summary. All these things out here. If you want to configure the notifications, then yes, definitely there are notifications out here. There are some pre-built notifications. You can do some new notifications out here telling when a build fails or when a pull request is created or updated. I can say next. I'll say, okay, fine, you know what, I want to go ahead and let's say send it to a custom email address. You can go ahead and do all these things out here
Sure.
under the notification sections.
Sorry, I missed out the entire week actually.
Mhm.
So
No worries.
service hooks, I mean, have we covered that already?
No, service hooks is something that I haven't covered. We'll talk about those. In where exactly or where can you really plug in something called as a service hook. We'll talk about that. Yes, any more questions, guys? So this is the workflow that I want to now build. So what I want to do right now is that I already have a release pipeline, which is creating. So if I edit this particular release pipeline, this release pipeline is using a template. So just to give you an idea of the template again, this release pipeline is using a template, which is generic in nature, parameterized. It has the plan name and the web app name parameterized. And the reason that I've, let's say, parameterized out here is because of the fact that I want to reuse this template in the QA, in the staging, and build my infrastructure and deploy my code. This is the reason why I wanted to go ahead and, let's say, generalize my template. So what I can now do is that this template is now generic. I can just go ahead and there is something called clone. I'll hit the clone button. I'll call this as a QA stage. Now I have something called QM. Then I'll do a clone. I'll say this is called as a UAT. Let's do this. A UAT environment. Then I'll do a clone
So instead of
and
cloning, can we put it in a centralized location and pull it from there, right? I mean, can we do that or it has to be cloned?
instead of it again, this is a classic pipeline, right? So you have to clone this out. If you're talking
Okay.
about putting it in a centralized location, you might want to, let's say, write down a YAML file for the same. But if it's a classic, then yes, you might have to clone this out here as such.
Generally, in real time, how will be done? I mean, how it will be done? Is it
We clone the stages. Yes, we do
clone
clone
it?
the stages. Yes, we clone the stages, but these days we are going for a YAML based approach. We will talk about that too. So I have cloned these out. I have a stage for dev, a QA, a UAT, then something called production. But there's one issue with this. See, what I did is that I created a central stage called dev, and in the dev, right, I am telling what is the name of the web app. So here I'm telling what is the name of the plan and what is the name of the web app that I'm going to create. Two different things out here. And then I'm using the same name out here to deploy the code. Now, what happens right now is that when you clone, even the QA intends to create the same resource group, dev.rg. So what I need to do is I come here, I need to change this to QA.rg. I need to come here, I need to change this to QA plan. I need to come here, I need to change this to QA web app DevOps, something like that. Then I need to come here, change this to QA. Then I need to go into UAT, perform the same thing, telling this is UAT.rg and this is a UAT plan, this is UAT web app. Then I need to go into the deployment, then I need to, let's say, go ahead and tell this is UAT web app and so on and so forth, and then production. Again, each and every stage right now just has two tasks, and these two tasks are consuming these variables. Imagine there are 20 different tasks out here in each and every stage. So every time you clone a stage, every time you create a new stage, you have to go ahead change all those parameters that needs to be changed, right? Now, for example, the name of the plan, the name of the web app. These are the two parameters that I need to change. Let's say you also need to change the location. You also need to change the tier in which you want to create. This is going to add a lot of administrative burden on you to go ahead and, let's say, change all these values in every different step of your pipeline. And it might also introduce a lot of human intervention errors. It introduces a lot of errors out here, right? So what I'll do, I'll first delete all these things. So what I'll do, I'll just click on a stage. I'll say delete. I'll just click on a stage, say delete out here, and I'll start again from the scratch. I'll say all those values which needs to be changed, I will parameterize it. And that's where a section called variables in Azure DevOps helps me out. Wherein it tells, okay, fine, you know what? You can declare a variable. So for example, I will say rg name to be my variable, and I'll say it is dev rg. I'm just calling this as a dev rg right now. I'll say plan name to be a variable, and I'll say it is a dev plan 01. I will say app service name to be my variable, and whatever's the app service name, let's go there, and let's get the app service name out here. What was the name? Yes, this one. I'll say it is a dev app service, something like this, to be my variable. And what I'll do in my tasks is that I'll do a variable replacement. What do I mean by that is simple. I have declared my variables, and in place of dev.rg, I'll call my variable. How do I call a variable in Azure DevOps? By using dollar open and close parenthesis. Inside that, the name of the variable. So it's a name value pair, and I'm calling the name out here, telling it is rg name. So I'm placing the dollar open and close parenthesis rg name out here. Location, I'm okay with this. And in place of plan name, so here I have a plan name value, and the value here is declared or it's hard coded. Now I want to replace this value by calling the variable called plan name. So I'd say, okay, fine. I don't need this to be plan name. Rather, I'll place this as dollar open close plan name out here. And then I have this particular web app name, which is again a variable with the name called app service name. I'm calling this out, and I'm telling here not to hard code. And sorry, I'm telling you not to hard code. And I'll say this is app service name. This is plan name, of course. Okay. And once going down here, again, I'll change this one to the app service name. So what I'm doing is that I'm using open the dollar open close parenthesis, and I'm calling my variables out here. I'll save this out. Save variables declared and using the same. So I'm calling all my variables out here. So what does this do is very simple. Instead of hard coding this right now, now this is generalized. I am not hard coding it out. I'm generalizing this out. Now if I clone, I'd say this is QA. And again, if you see this out, right, QA is using the same variables as development. It's telling RG name. There is no value. Plan name, app service name. And here it's telling deployment name. Here it is telling app service name out here. What I can do right now is that now I can declare one more set of variables. Telling app service name, plan name, and then the RG name out here. Three different things I can declare out here. And now if you see, it's giving me an error here telling that the variable app service is already defined. So this name is already defined called web app, dev web app, something like this. But what I want here is that for QA, I need this to be something like QA web app. I need this to be something like QA. I need this to be something like dev. Here it is dev, so I want this to be something like QA. And instead of dev RG, I want it to be QA RG out here as such. So I want these values. Now what I want to tell is that these three values, starting with the dev, they need to apply to a stage called development. And these three values that are coming with QA, they need to be applied to a stage called QA. I want to segregate them out. And that's where variable scope comes into picture. Meaning you can tell where this variable is really applied. For example, the reason that I'm getting this error is because all these variables, if I just scroll to the right, all these variables are scoped to a release, which means that all the stages in your pipeline can use these variables. But again, you cannot have two variables with the same name. You can only have one variable. So for example, if I delete this out, this error will go out. Reason being, you cannot have two variables with the same name that is scoped to the same release out here. So I'll copy this out. I'll just make a new variable out here. I'll say this is QA, and this is what it has. So it's now telling, okay, fine. I'm declaring the variables. I'm telling this is a release variables out here. So it's now telling the entire release pipeline can use the same set of variables. But now I want to now segregate this out. I want to tell that these first three variables, which is dev, 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 they are only scoped to a stage. Okay, they're only scoped to a particular stage. Okay, why isn't this working? Fine, give me a second. Okay, they're only now scoped to a stage called dev, dev, and dev. What this means is that these variables that you see here, okay, these variables that you really see here called dev can only apply or can only be referred to by this particular stage called dev. It's not a release variable, it's an environment variable is what I'm now telling. And if I go here, I would say QA, I would say QA, I would say QA. So now I have two different set of variables, three each, one for a stage called dev, the other for a stage called QA, and they have their own values. So what I'm now telling is that the name of the app service that dev will get would be something like dev app service. QA will get is a QA app service out here. So these are the terminologies that are changing, and there are no release variables, meaning there are no common variables that these two can refer to. There are no common variables. Release variables are all common variables out here. And why am I telling there are no release variables? Reason being, I do not have a variable set to the release scope. Now, if I do that, this variable called app service name will be common to all the stages. It will now act as a common variable, but I don't want to do that. I want to say something like dev, and I'll now say save. I'll now say create a release. And now it's telling, do you want me to continuously deploy to dev and also the QA? you can do it as a manual trigger as well. If it's blue, it is continuous. If it's ash in color, it's manual. I'll say, okay, fine, you know what, I want to go ahead and do the deployment continuously. And this is the artifact that I want to really use out, which was created yesterday, the latest artifact that was built by my build pipeline. I'll create, and now I have a release 7, and release 7 is a multi-stage release pipeline. It's not a single stage. It's a multi-stage release pipeline which has its own set of variables. The dev has its own set of variables. The QA has its own set of variables. For example, if I go and click on the logs of development environment, so it's now telling, okay, fine, it's initializing job and all that stuff. And while it's running for dev, if you click on the variables, you'll only see the first 3 variables that are scoped to this particular environment called dev out here. There are no common variables out here. There are no common variables that dev and QA together can use. And that's the reason it's not showing any other variable out here as such. If you click on QA and say variables, now do you see QA has a different set of variables that are scoped to this particular environment? And this is how it's now working. Now it's telling, okay, fine, I'll create the infrastructure. And here in the infrastructure, it's telling you that, okay, fine, it's a dev RG that I'm creating. There is nothing called dev RG. So I'm going ahead and creating that. And I'll deploy the code onto particular, let's say, app service after I create it. And once this is done, it will directly move to the second stage, which is QA. And will now start creating a resource group called QARG, an app service plan called QA app service plan 1, and a web app called QA DevOps web app, something like that. This is how I am declaring variables for the purpose of reusability. For the purpose of reusability, because all I want to do is just clone the task, or I just want to clone the stage, and then start just referring my variables out here. That's it. This is how I want to make my job easy, being an infrastructure or automation engineer out here as such. Yes, any questions here in the variables part, in the variable declaration and the usage of variables out here as such?
Because we have selected continuous
Mm-hmm.
deployment,
Great.
so from dev to QA, automatically it will go to the next stage, right? Once it completes.
Correct. So once it completes, it just moves into the next stage out here as such.
So this has to provision into 2 different infrastructure altogether, right? So dev is
Correct.
in
It will
one and QA.
exactly. Exactly. It's a different infrastructure, and we are deploying 2 different things out here. One is the dev RG, the second is the QA RG. And inside that, I have a plan for development, I have a plan for QA, altogether different environments out here as such.
But the code is same. Okay.
Code is same. The reason we suggest having different environments out here is the division of teams. Probably the developers need only the access to one particular resource group called dev RG, so I can do an IAM out there. QAs may want to read the development RG, and they also want to have a contributor access to the QA, so I can do some specific roles out here, and I can separate it. Very importantly, I can separate all these things from a production environment. I can tell, you know what, production only a DevOps engineer or only an operations team, only a client can have access to. A developer or a QA, they cannot directly go into the production environment and let's say change the code. They cannot do that. They have to follow the pipeline process. And for the pipeline process, I can have approvals and checks out there as such. So I can establish an accountability. If I have different stages out here, it'll be easy for me to do that. So it's now done with dev. So it's now telling that, okay, fine. If I go into my resource groups, I have a dev RG. Inside that, I have the app service plan and the app service that got created. And if I also go ahead and browse my app service, the code deployment is also done. So if I browse my app service out here, it's going to tell that, okay, fine, this dev web app service has a random code out here, some random code, version 2 of my code running in the development environment out here as such. The same thing now is going into QA, the same code. Now I'm imagining that the code is deployed in development. The developers have tested this out. They've created, seen all the functionalities, and then the code is now deployed into the QA. And now again, if you check this out right now, it's creating an infrastructure called QARG. So it's not creating a dev RG here. It's creating a QARG out here. And also it will end up creating a plan called QA plan 1 and an app service called QA web app, so on and so forth out here as such. And how am I referring the variables? I'm just mentioning it as dollar open close and the name of the variable that was declared. That is how I am mentioning, that's how I am ending up mentioning the name of the variable out here as such. So again, this will go here, create the infrastructure, then deploy the code so that QAs can go ahead and let's say test their code and then promote it onto let's say the next environments out here as such. This is how my pipeline is now flowing out here as such.
If you want to
Yes.
put some controls in between dev and QA, then we need to go for manual deployment.
Uh, Again,
Like,
you can put a control. Again, what you can do is that you can put something called post deployment condition, meaning
okay.
someone needs to approve this out. You can still have a continuous delivery process, but what will happen is that once your code is done here or once the pipeline is done here, it won't move to the next environment until you get an approval.
Yeah.
So once you hit the approval button, once you hit the approve button, we'll also see that. We'll also see how the approvals are put in. Once you hit the approval button, then it moves into the next stage and then goes with the continuous deployment approach out here as such. So now if you check this out, it should have also done with QA right now. So it's deploying the code onto QA. And now if you see by the logs, I can say that it has created a QA web app. So if you look at my resource groups right now, refresh the screen, I have a QA RG that got created from my Azure DevOps pipeline. And I have a QA plan, a QA web app out here on which the code deployment is now going on. It's also done right now. And if I come here and let's say browse this out, I have something called QA Azure websites.net. It's telling a random code out here, version 2. It still says running in dev, reason being it is hard coded in the code. So that's something that I'll change at a later point in time. But this is now a QA app service on which the code is now running on. And all these things are created using an automated approach via my pipeline. And I am using the variables out here in my pipeline in order to go ahead and let's say do this out here as such. Yes. Any questions? Now what I can do is that I can clone the stage. I can say this is UAT. I can clone one more stage out here. I can say this is production. I can give a complete end-to-end pipeline right now. And as and when I clone, right, guys, please observe this. I said UAT, I said production. As and when I do that, Azure DevOps automatically creates those environment variables for you, UAT and production. Values is something that you have to change. You have to change all these values. Yes, that's something which is still manual, but there's also a trick for that. See, again, there are three variables per an environment that I'm declaring. Abscess plan, or there are just three variables per an environment that I'm declaring. I have four different environments, so altogether I'll have like about 12 variables that I need to let's say really manage. Again, if the number of environments are more, let's say there are about 20 environments, so about 60 variables is something that I need to declare out here. Or each and every let's say each and every environment is requiring somewhere around 25 variables out here, then that again becomes a huge headache for me to manage this out. So let me delete this out once again and let me come via a similar approach or a simple approach. What I would do is that instead of declaring my variables out here, now if you see my variables, right, they're following a pattern. My resource groups are starting with dev, ending with RG, starting with QA, ending with RG, meaning RG is common here, plan is common here, web app, DevOps, something like this is common here. The only thing that is changing is dev, QA, or the name of the team. So what I'll do is that I'll firstly delete all these variables. I'll say plan name is okay. Let's see. So I'll delete all the variables that are scoped to QA. I'll say this is okay. This is delete this out and delete this out. So I have three variables out here. And what I want to do is that I want to introduce one more variable out here telling it is team name. I'll say it is dev for dev, QA for QA. So I'll put one more team name out here, QA for QA out here. And what I'll now do is I'll just change the scope to QA. Now what I'll now do is that I'll make these variables app service plan, the app service name, plan name, and the RG name as common variables. How do I do that? I put them under release. common variables out here, but I would want to make sure that these values are dynamic. So this is nothing but whatever is the team name. So what I'll do is I'll call the team name here. I can do that. I can call a variable inside a variable. I can say whatever is the team name, get that, and then go and construct the name out here. Here I can change this to team name. Here I can change this to, let's say, something like team name again. In this case, or if I do it in this way, if I simply go ahead and clone the task to UAT or to something like production, all I would need to do is just change the value here. I'll say UAT. I'll say production. So now I have just four variables that are dynamic or four variables that are changing. The other variables are generated dynamically depending upon the scope they have. So these three variables are common across the release. So it's telling, okay, fine, every stage in the environment can use this, but each and every variable out here depends upon the environment variable. So if you're triggering out a release, let's say for development, it will say, okay, fine, I'll use this particular environment variable plus these three, and I'll generate the values of these three variables depending upon this particular value. If it's for QA, it'll use this plus these three for QA. For UAT, it'll use this plus these three for UAT. For production, it'll use this plus these three for, let's say, that particular production environment, and generates these values depending upon this particular value out here as such. Now, what I can now do is I can simply go ahead. Also, if you want to change the task here, you can also say creating infrastructure for a team name. You can also call the variable here. I'll say deployment to $app service name. Set the name, yes. $app service name, something like that. Now if I save this out and now create a release into all these environments, again I'll make sure that I only trigger it out for dev. QA, UAT, and production, I'll do it as a manual deployment. I don't want a continuous deployment there. So now if you see the pipeline structure is slightly changed. It's not a linear. It's, let's say, a vertical pipeline out here where I'm deploying continuously into development, but QA and etc. I'm not intending to take the code out here. And check this out. Now into the logs, check the variables. These are the four variables that this particular stage can use. One being the team name, which is dev. All the other variables are generated from this particular variable. And now if you look at the logs, it's now going to tell, okay, download the artifact. Now see, it's telling create the infrastructure for, I said $team name. Now that particular $team name got changed into development called dev. And now it's telling, okay, fine, I'll check the infrastructure since the infrastructure is already there. I'm good with that. And then it's telling deployment to this particular app service. Here I said deployment to app service name out here as such. This is how I'm using the variables for or to my advantage, and I'm declaring something known as a release variables, which are common to all the releases. And these variables, right, which are generic in nature, which are not really hard coded, I'm making these as common variables, and the ones that change, I'm making them as environment variables out here. So the principle that you need to follow is this: whatever is common, please put it at the release level. Whatever changes, please put it at the environment level out here so that you can alternatively change them and produce new values out here as such. Yes. Any questions that I can take till you? Anyone? Any questions that I can take till you? Again, in theory, it might look really overwhelming. You have to practice this, guys. You have to put your hands here. You have to practice this out to understand what I'm really doing out here as such. Again, please make sure to ask as many as questions as possible so that I can address those. I can understand what are the areas that we need to really focus upon, what are the areas that we really not understand, so I can address those questions specifically out here as such. Yes, any questions? Anyone, any questions?
సార్
Good, please.
సార్ సార్ ఇది కాదు సార్ నాది నాకు ఇప్పుడు రెజ్యూమ్ కావాలి సార్
Sir, firstly, one thing, sir,
admin mail.
I'll tell you what. Firstly, please attend the classes regularly. You are coming for the first half an hour, first 20 minutes. You're not attending the rest of the class, sir. You're not doing that. When you're asking for resume, again, sir, please send me an email. That's what I'm telling you again and again. Please send me an email so that I can address that out. The reason I'm asking you to send me an email is because tomorrow when you go to the office, go to the organization, you will talk to each other in the emails. And very importantly, that's what I'm telling you again and again. Please attend the session on a regular basis. You are attending for the first 20 minutes, not attending for the 40. So you won't be able to you won't be able to really understand anything. And again, if you're asking for a resume, please send me an email so that I can give you the resume. You can modify it accordingly and then send it to me, send it back to me for the review.
Sir, I see recorded videos, sir.
That's fine, sir. But with the recording videos, you won't be able to get anything. That's what I'm telling you. And sir, you would need some help. You would need some help online. You need some help offline. Because, sir, you're trying to get into an IT industry which you do not really know, right? So you need some additional help on that. And if you watch recording videos, you cannot get your questions addressed. And I don't even see emails coming from you, right? So how can I really help you out then?
Sir, okay, sir.
Yes, any more questions, guys? Again, guys, the reason I'm asking you all to attend the classes again and again, reason being, see, this might be a new concept to a lot of people. You know, some people might have already been working into it, and they'll be able to easily follow it. Some people might not be working into it, and it'll become a little difficult for you to really understand that framework. So please attend these classes regularly. Do not drop in between the session. If you do that, you lose the consistency. Simply, you'll just go ahead, forward the videos, see the recording. You won't be able to, or I won't be able to address your questions if you do the recording out there. So please send me across emails. Please, before you send me across the emails again, try to Google it out. Google it out, telling what is your doubt. If you're able to Google out, right, see, 70% of your problems are actually solved. In the IT industry, 70% of the problem are actually solved by doing a Google search. Very simple. This is the fact. If you do the Google, if you understand what is your problem, and then go ahead and do a simple search out here, you will be able to address most of your issues. That's the reason I'm forcing you all to do that. And I'm forcing you all to send me emails. The reason being, I can correct your terminology in an email, because tomorrow when you go to the industry and start writing emails, right, it's very important for us to put a professional email out there. That's very important. All these, really matter out there. So please do send me across emails. Please do, get your questions addressed so that I can understand what are the areas that you're not really following, and I can take those out here as such. So yes, any questions for today? Anything that I can take for today? Anyone? Any questions as such? All right, so that's it I had from my end. Thank you guys and have a good day ahead. And about the class tomorrow, I'll just keep you all informed about whether we have a class or not, because I'll be traveling most of the day. So I'll try to take a class. If not, we will meet on Monday and we'll discuss on further concepts out here as such. Thank you and have a good day ahead.